This camera has maybe seen some shit. Of all the vintage gear that I own, this brick is the one that I wish I knew the most about what it's been through before it came into my hands. This is a Bell & Howell Eyemo, and in its prime, you could typically find it in situations like this. Today, if you put the Eyemo beside a compact digital camera, there's no competition. 4K, ultra clean, sharp results. It's very easy to record a lot of footage onto it. It's instantaneous. It also has sound. But if you rewind like 90 years or so, this Eyemo was one of the most compact movie cameras out there. This camera shoots 35mm motion picture film, which was the format of choice for most movies ever made before digital filmmaking overtook it in the early 2000s. There are countless 35mm movie cameras out there, but I think the Eyemo deserves a bit of a spotlight. Bell & Howell is a name you're likely to find on a large number of film cameras and projectors. Primarily movie cameras for shooting regular 8, Super 8, 16mm, and 35mm, along with projectors and photo cameras as well. Started in 1907 by Donald Bell and Albert Howell in Chicago, Bell & Howell developed the 2709 standard motion picture camera in 1912. The high quality of the film movement mechanisms in this camera made it a prominent choice for use in early Hollywood. In 1923, Bell & Howell released the first spring-driven 16mm camera, the Filmo 70. The Filmo is a significant camera in its own right, as it helped to introduce people to the new Kodak film format of 16mm. It would go on to have many different models over the years, but would also serve as the inspiration for a 35mm camera of the same design, the Eyemo. Introduced in 1926, 3 years after the Filmo, the Eyemo was the most compact 35mm movie camera being made. The Eyemo uses a spring-wound motor that transports the film through the camera. You wind up the camera using a crank or a key which tightens the spring, and then you press this button on the bottom to run the motor. The internal film compartment takes 100-foot rolls of 35mm movie film, which was available for decades on these spools, referred to as daylight spools, because you can load them outside of complete darkness and not ruin the film. The Eyemo's film transport is a very basic mechanism. The shutter spins and a pull-down claw beside the film gate grabs the perforations of the film and advances it through the camera. Just like with all motion picture film cameras, when the opening of the shutter is in front of the film gate, a single frame of film is exposed. More sophisticated cameras often have a registration pin, which engages the perforations to hold the film firmly in place while each frame is being exposed, resulting in a steadier image than you get with a camera like the Eyemo. For example, this later RE 35mm camera will advance the film with a pull-down claw, and then these two pins come out and engage with the sprockets to firmly hold the frame in place as it is exposed, and then it's advanced to the next frame. And this is done dozens of times every second. And of course, the Eyemo is a silent camera. Sound on film, barring a few special examples like certain broadcast cameras that took special film, was almost always recorded separately anyways and added to the film later on. Certain Eyemo models, such as the original Model 71A, only held a single lens on the front of the camera. Other models, such as the Eyemo 71C, had a turret so that 3 lenses could be mounted on the camera at once. You decide which lens you want to shoot with and rotate it into place in front of the film gate, a design feature that became common on many movie cameras. There are quite a few models of the Eyemo. Single lens models, turret models, even different turret models called spiders, which had a viewfinder on one of the turret positions so you could see through a certain lens, models with keys for winding, models with cranks for winding, models that allowed for larger magazines to be attached to hold more film. Some models had a separate spot where you could use a crank so that you could rewind the film. Models like the 71QM took electronic motor attachments, and even later on, there were heavily modified models that shoot different aspect ratios or can take different lenses and even have modified viewfinders. Really, there's an Eyemo out there for all of us. Most of the time, these cameras lacked a reflex viewfinder. We're spoiled today because practically every camera you will ever buy will show you exactly what the lens is seeing. In fact, a lot of older cameras did as well, such as the beloved SLR. You look through the viewfinder and you see out the lens through a series of mirrors. Thus, a reflex viewfinder is born. This viewfinder system also exists in motion picture cameras such as reflex Bolex models. But cameras like this Eyemo are non-reflex cameras, which is why you have a viewfinder on the film door or on this side of the turret. This viewfinder on the door would allow you to select a focal length which matched your shooting lens in order to help you approximate framing while shooting. You wouldn't see focus or your exposure change, you would just see an approximation of the frame that you're capturing. The compact size of this camera made it perfect for journalists and combat camera operators, which is one of the reasons why such high quality footage of World War II exists. You could use pretty reliable cameras to shoot 16mm or 35mm film in the field, during a battle, or in an aircraft, for newsreels, because of the Eyemo and similar compact movie cameras at the time. My Eyemo is a Model 71Z, and it was given to me by a fan of the channel named Levi a few years ago. And it's taken me a while to get around to using this camera because of the costs associated with it. It's in incredible condition, and probably the most striking thing about the camera is this original plaque that's on it. Property US Army Air Corps camera, bomb spotting, 35mm. And that is why I'd love to know what this camera has been through. This camera with no film inside and just this little lens on the front weighs in at about 7 pounds. This Eyemo has a crank on the side, which takes a bit of effort to wind up the powerful spring inside of the camera for the motor. On a completely full wind, the camera will run for about 25 to 30 seconds when running at 24 frames per second for the frame rate. This model can be set to several different frame rate speeds: 8 frames per second, 12, 16, and 24. Other Eyemo models could go above 24 frames per second with options such as 32 and 48 frames per second. Here, there's a footage counter that can be set to 0 at the beginning of a roll and then will advance as you shoot through the 100 feet of film. On some of them, there's a little exposure guide on the side that gives a reference of what your aperture should be set to depending on the ISO of your film and the shooting conditions of either bright, hazy, or dark. On top of mine are handwritten shutter speed numbers based on the frame rate setting, which helps me to expose the film. And this is also very cool because I will just never know who wrote these. But this is incredibly useful information because these are some odd speeds that I wouldn't have known without a reference. When shooting at 24 frames per second, the shutter angle of this Eyemo model is equal to about 1/480th of a second, which means that this camera has a very small shutter angle of about 20 degrees. We can see how small this opening in the shutter is from this image of the shutter assembly for this Eyemo model. This is a rather odd angle. Typically, a motion picture camera's shutter angle that we're used to is about 180 degrees, which equates to around 1/40th of a second, as opposed to 1/480th of a second for the exposure time. So this camera isn't well suited for using in low light conditions. Because the exposure time is so fast though, it does mean reduced motion blur on each frame. This fast shutter could be because the camera was used for military purposes where the film would have been studied afterwards. My specific Eyemo lacks a viewfinder on the film door. Instead it has this metal plate, which would have been for something. I'm not sure what would have originally mounted here. It looks like it was modified for some other accessory, maybe just some other viewfinder accessory at some point. Inside of the camera is the film compartment. The Eyemo takes 100-foot rolls of film on these spools. The film is threaded through these rollers and between the film gate and pressure plate. By moving this piece back, you can easily thread the camera.
The film needs to have a good sized loop above and below the gate, and placing a finger here helps to space it out. After the film is around the rollers, this piece can be pushed back into place. A second spool is needed at the bottom as a take-up. And that's all you need to load an Eyemo. Very quick and easy to do in a variety of situations.
Spring-wound movie cameras are like really well-made watches. It's just springs and gears inside, and as you wind it up, then you can adjust the speed and shoot. Because of this, as long as the camera is well-maintained, it will survive for a very long time. The Eyemo has little holes inside the film compartment labeled for applying oil to help maintain the mechanisms. When I first got the camera, I applied a very small amount of this oil to these points, and the motor has been running really well ever since. Of course, there are a lot of things that can impact these cameras over time that require a bit more maintenance than just a little bit of oil on the mechanisms, but for the most part, there's not really a lot of things being made today that will still run 80 or 90 years from now with just a little bit of oil, especially not cameras.
The design of the Eyemo and the Filmo is similar to other non-Bell & Howell cameras, such as the iconic 16mm Bolex, which was introduced several years later. A spring-wound camera that takes 100-foot rolls of film on daylight spools, quick and easy to use, they often have lens turrets, and are impressive little mechanical marvels. Although, the Eyemo could definitely take a Bolex in a fight.
But what does it take to make use of an Eyemo camera today? Even though the cameras are old, a really well-maintained one can run beautifully. However, having a functioning camera itself is only part of the equation. It is very expensive to shoot, develop, and digitally transfer even 100 feet of 35mm motion picture film.
First of all, as I have mentioned, the Eyemo takes the film on spools. Currently, no film manufacturer puts their 35mm film on these spools anymore. Years ago, you could find 100 feet of 35 packaged like this, in these little metal canisters that had the film on those metal spools. Kodak no longer does this. You can only buy 35 motion picture rolls in 200, 400, or 1000 foot amounts now, and they come wound tightly on these plastic cores. In the photo world, you can buy 100-foot 35 rolls intended for bulk loading, and yes, because of the Eyemo's lack of registration pins, these rolls can go through an Eyemo. So if you really wanted to buy 100 feet of HP5 and shoot it this way, you can. But these bulk rolls also come on plastic cores and not spools. I was lucky to find a bunch of the nice metal spools on eBay a few years back for not a bad price, and one day I was also walking down the street and found some of these, Copex microfilm boxes that had plastic 35 spools in them. Microfilm was often used for photographing documents and could be purchased in a few different sizes, including 35mm, but microfilm was typically unperforated. But 35 rolls of it used to come on plastic spools, which do work in Eyemos. You need these spools. There's not really a way around it. In fact, you need at least two, one with film on it and one as the take-up in your camera.
There are a few ways to get 100 feet of 35mm motion picture film for the Eyemo. You can seek out short ends and recans, which is leftover film from productions. You can take a look online because now lots of people will sell 100-foot rolls of Vision 3 and XX cinema film that people can buy and cut down for shooting stills with. Or if you have really deep pockets, then you can just buy fresh 400-foot roll of 35 and then cut it down into 4 100-foot rolls in a darkroom. Ideally, you would cut down larger rolls and put them onto the Eyemo spools in a darkroom on a film editing bench, or at least some sort of bench that has film rewinds. Alternatively, you can also do this in like a dark bag or like a change bag, some sort of dark environment that you might have, just a regular darkroom where you take the bigger roll of 35 and then just slowly wind it onto the Eyemo spools. But I'm just gonna quickly demonstrate like how you would do a 35 roll down from a larger roll using actual film rewinds onto like an Eyemo spool. And I'm gonna use not real film because I don't want to destroy real film, even if it's old and I might use it. I'm gonna use a dummy roll, which is film that has already been ruined by somebody else. Dummy rolls are incredibly useful, especially for like practicing to load a camera. So in the dark, you would have a split reel, which is just a film reel that comes apart. And so if I have film on a plastic core like this, then I can put it onto the split reel, and then I can put that onto the rewind. And that's how you put film that is on a core onto a reel very easily. We also have these like tension kind of springs that will go onto a film rewind, so then it won't, you know, move around when you have the reel on there. And then we have the nice metal Eyemo spool. So winding 100 feet of film onto one of these spools, it doesn't have to be like super accurate, and usually it's something like 40 or 42 or 45 winds, but I can also just go until I feel it pretty close to the top of the spool. And then you just wind. And then you have a pretty full spool for the Eyemo. You also probably want like a little metal can or one of these, as I mentioned, boxes that the microfilm rolls used to come in, something that you can kind of safely store the film on the spool inside of.
When it comes to 35mm motion picture film, depending on the camera that you use, you'll get different frame sizes and run times from your film. Most 35mm cinema cameras shoot 4perf, meaning you have a frame that is 4 perforations tall. This is usually then matted later on for the aspect ratio of the final movie. Fine, but you can end up with a lot of wasted space on the film. This is all viable space for an image, and because editing has changed and you're not necessarily likely to project a print of your 35mm film, some people opt for shooting with cameras that do 3 or 2perf.
2perf and 3perf cameras allow you to shoot longer amounts of footage than 4perf cameras. However, unless you happen to have a nice modified one from over the years, the Eyemo is a 4perf 35mm movie camera. When you're running 100 feet of 35 film through a camera that is shooting 4perf at 24 frames per second, you get about 1 minute of footage. 60 seconds. You can get more out of a roll by shooting at lower frame rates on the camera, but that does impact how smooth your footage looks.
Last year, I finally got out with the Eyemo and shot some film through it. The lack of a viewfinder makes things more awkward than they kind of already are with this camera, but I used a viewfinder app on my phone, which lets me set my frame size and lens focal length to give me an idea of framing with the camera, which probably is how they did it in World War II as well. I shot using this Bell & Howell IMAX, no relation, 2-inch, which is about 50mm f2.8 lens. The lens on an Eyemo slides in and this little hook holds it in place. Then you can adjust focus and aperture. This knob on the top can tighten and prevent the focus from moving at all. I tried my hand originally at shooting some expired +X black and white film from a large roll that is quite old.
Amazing. 10 seconds of what is probably some very shaky 35mm footage. Well, that's it. 90, 80, 100 feet of +X, however much that is. Do I think I made good use of it? Maybe.
After I had shot this first roll, I tried my best to actually develop it myself using the large Filmomat developing tank that I have. The development isn't great, and this is primarily because I had problems loading all 80 or 100 feet or so into the Filmomat tank, where some of the film wasn't on the spiral properly, so it rubbed together during development. I also don't have a scanner for 35mm motion picture film. Very few people do. There's no consumer grade cheapo option like the Wolverine that you can get for Super 8 film, and I didn't want to take this in somewhere and pay for scanning because the footage isn't worth it. I do, however, have access to a very nice Steenbeck flatbed editor, so I can watch this film, although it's a negative, so it's not really meant to be watched, and I can do a really rough transfer. Not very good by traditional standards, but this was film that I already owned, so I'm not upset to have wasted it. What I did learn though is that the Eyemo looks to be advancing the film properly, the frame spacing looks good throughout the roll, and it doesn't look like anything is wrong with the shutter. Once I knew that for sure, I decided to put some color film through this thing. I had some old Vision 2 250D and 50D sitting around that I figured was probably okay, so I rolled some onto metal spools and shot it through the Eyemo.
Start in the middle and then just move around within that area.
So I had shot 200 feet of color 35mm film, and then I had to get it processed and scanned. And this is the real killer. Potentially, yes, you can do some of these things by hand. You can develop 100 feet of movie film in a tank. There are choices here. I've got this big spiral Filmomat tank that I showed, but it's hard to load 100 feet of 35 onto this perfectly. There's also the Morse tank, where the film is wound back and forth and involves simply putting the roll onto one of these reels. However, because you're winding it back and forth like this, it can be hard to get consistent developed images. But because I'm making this video and I can kind of mentally justify certain things for this, I decided to shell out for lab processing and also lab scanning. I'm located in Toronto, Canada. Luckily, we have Niagara Custom Lab, which typically fills my motion picture processing needs. Super 8 and 16mm, usually all my stuff goes there. However, 200 feet of 35mm isn't great for a lab that doesn't get a lot of 35, and running those machines is expensive, especially for color, and a lot of the time, kind of the minimum quantity for 35 is 400 feet. And they can't scan 35. There is Frame Discrete in the city, which is dedicated purely to scanning motion picture film, but for this I've just decided to look at some other options.
The film photography project offers specifically a service for 100-foot quantities of 35 developing and scanning, so for this time around, that's what I decided to go with. Of course, that also meant having to mail the film to New Jersey. Not a big deal, but hey, at this point, I may as well just pile on the costs. So after waiting a couple of weeks, I got these back. 2 100-foot rolls of developed 35mm film, my color negatives, and scans for both. This is gorgeous footage. Even though the film is quite a few years old, it came out looking great. Man, I would shoot 35 all the time. But let's talk costs. In my situation, the film didn't really cost me anything. I've had these short ends of Vision 2 film for a while, just kicking around. It's just kind of the life that I lead. But buying 100 feet of Vision 3 35mm color film will run you, let's say, anywhere from $100 to $200 Canadian, maybe even a little bit more depending on where you get it from. Or you can buy 400 feet for between $400 and $500 Canadian. The cost for developing and scanning 200 feet with only an HD scan, not 2K or 4K, was $253 Canadian. That includes shipping the film back to me, but I paid to ship it there, which I think was probably like $30. So lab and shipping costs for these 2 minutes of 35mm film came to about $300 Canadian. Yeah.
Will I use the Eyemo again? Probably, I think so. Probably foolishly at some point. I do have 100 feet of Kodak Black and White XX kicking around that I have been holding onto for a while, but I have nothing really to shoot with it at the moment. I think if I were to use this again though, I need a proper viewfinder. The app is fine, but just anything. So I should probably look into that. Maybe some handle or like something to put on the bottom. It is fine on a tripod, but it is something that, you know, it was kind of meant to be like handheld, so it's not impossible. And really, if I could get like okay at developing 100 feet of 35 myself, even if it was just black and white, then that would eliminate like a big hassle of sending it to the lab every time I want to use it. But this little camera has still got it. I don't know what it has seen in the past, but it is safe now. In order to briefly up the production value of this video, I want to show the Eyemo just against a few other 35mm movie cameras from over the decades. I don't have access to, you know, like every single one of them and some of the very high-end ones like Panavision cameras, and I'm also not shooting more 35mm because I've already blown through the budget for that, but it's always just nice to see more cameras. Let's start around the same time as the Eyemo. The Eyemo wasn't the only kind of compact 35mm movie camera. There was also the DeVry cameras, which are not quite as compact as the Eyemo, but this is still more compact than like a production 35 camera from around that same era. This camera is affectionately referred to as the DeVry lunchbox camera because it kind of looks like a lunchbox. It shoots 35mm and it takes 100-foot film on spools. There is also a little bit more involved with loading the lunchbox, so it's not as quick and easy to use as the Eyemo. But it came out in the mid-1920s, right around the same time as the Eyemo, so it is like a direct competitor of the time. It is both a spring-driven and a hand-wound camera, which means that you can either wind up the spring in it, just like I've been showing with the Eyemo, and then run it, or you can put the hand crank into a different area of the camera and then manually wind the film through the camera. Moving into the 1960s, we have the Arriflex 2C, which is just another iconic camera. We've seen a lot of these typically in also wartime footage, Vietnam footage. This is the 2C model and it came out in the 1960s. It has a 3-lens turret on the front and then a magazine on the top. This is a 400-foot magazine, but you could also get these little 200-foot magazines as well. These are like somewhat friendly to be handheld. It's kind of got like a molded grip on one side, although they can get heavy because you have motor down here and then that has to go out to a battery source, and then you also need, you know, 400 feet of film or 200 feet of film in the magazine on top. Jumping ahead another couple of decades, we have the Arriflex BL4, which is a production quality 35mm camera, and it has been used on a lot of productions over the years. We're talking movies like Terminator 2, Fargo, Home Alone 2, Leon the Professional, Trainspotting. The BL4 could take 400-foot or 1,000-foot size magazines. BL stands for blimped,
which means that it runs very quietly so that you can record audio on set without too much of a problem. The first 35 REBL was released in the early 70s, and the BL4 is from the mid 1980s. So if I attach a battery and close the door and run the camera at 24 frames per second, then we can hear it side by side in EYEMO to have an idea of how much quieter this camera is in comparison to the little EYEMO. And this is 24 frames per second on the BL4. You can barely hear it running, but I mean, I can hear it when I'm standing like right beside the camera. If you were far away from it, trying to record audio, it's not really an issue. See, we can see it running, and even with the magazine cover off, it is still like pretty quiet when I'm standing this far from it. Very nice, very, very nice camera. Besides the DeVry and the EYEMO, there are of course other compact 35 cameras from around the same time and in the decades that followed. During World War II, for example, there were Soviet-made EYEMO copies such as the KS-50B. And even before the EYEMO came out, there was the adorable Kinamo, something like that, which did shoot 35mm, but only in 50 or 80 foot amounts. So the EYEMO is not the most versatile and reliable movie camera by any means, but it has its modern uses. And there are heavily modified ones out there that have video taps and PL lens mounts, and ones that are used as crash cams on certain productions. Like actually, EYEMOs have been used on Transformers, The Expendables, Bad Boys 2, Requiem for a Dream, Fast and Furious 7, Bourne Ultimatum, the J.J. Abrams Super 8 movie, Twister, The Fifth Element, Quantum of Solace. You wouldn't shoot a whole feature with this thing, of course, 1 minute at a time. I mean, you could, but for instances where you need a little bit of footage on 35mm film in an action sequence, you can mod an EYEMO and put it into a dangerous situation that you wouldn't use a larger camera for.
I am obsessed with this camera, especially now that I have actually shot some stuff with it. The perfectly moving mechanisms and like the tactile sensations involved with running the camera and loading it is just so satisfying. There is something about like the chunk sound of it running on the lower frame rate speed, and then the buzzsaw sound of it running at 24 frames per second. This camera does something to my brain, even just like loading up a dummy roll, winding up the camera and watching the film move through it. This is like my white noise machine. Like I could fall asleep to the sound of this thing running. I consider the EYEMO to be maybe the coolest camera that I own. It's definitely one that I like to show off to people if we're going through cameras and stuff. But it does not get a lot of use because I would be so broke so quick. But it's iconic, and the EYEMO is such a notable part of like motion picture film history, especially in the dawn of this in the early 1900s. And these cameras have captured so much stuff and been put to so many different uses in such a variety of situations over the past 100 years. But for your wallet's sake, think very, very carefully before you decide to get into using one of these. Thank you so much for checking this out, and thank you to Levi, who sent me an EYEMO camera 2 or 3 years ago, and it sat on a shelf until I had the time and the money to put this whole thing together. You can find ways to support the channel through links in the description down below, like a little bit of merch. There's also a Patreon, some affiliate links for websites like Pro 8mm and Polaroid and Freestyle Photo if you make purchases through there. And thank you so much for checking this out, and I'll see you soon.